We are living in a time of many problems. We have just recovered from a pandemic, we are at war, and we are on the edge of many other crises. However, we are not far from the worst times in history, and I am not referring to long ago wars and diseases that took thousands of lives in the distant past, but to the years that our grandparents and parents lived, years in which they opened their eyes to a world devoid of freedom, built on fear and terror, a world of poverty and shortage. Even children and their parents became enemies, a world that bore the name Communism. Romania experienced communism as well. Some saw it as a period of grace, while others would never go back in time. What exactly is communism? And what policies do communists promote? Communism is a social, political, and economic ideology that seeks to establish a social order with no social classes and private property in which the means of production are shared and goods are divided according to need. How did communism appear? The League of Communists was a communist Christian organization founded in London in 1836 as the League of the Righteous. Karl Marx, a member of this organization, apostatized from its Christian character, transforming it through the Communist Manifesto into an organization with a materialistic and athletic ideology that explained through class struggle that the capitalist system cannot be changed without using revolutionary violence to overturn the traditional social order. For Marx, any form of religion is a drug to numb the people. The regime pillars were propaganda, which was used to brainwash the masses with all-encompassing Marxist-Leninist teaching, and terror, which was based on a massive repressive apparatus, the peak of which was represented by the secret police. Terror and repression were used against enemies of the nation, real or imaginated, both from outside and within the party. Terror had a random character and millions were victims. Gheorghe Dej was the head of state responsible for most crimes in 20th century in Romania. Forces the abdication of King Mihai in 30 December 1947. Industry, finance, trade, all had been nationalized. The peasantry had been collectivized. Nicolae Ceaușescu. He was the head of state in charge of Romania's industrialization. He had a strong external influence as a result of his visits to the world's great powers. He was the only Romanian to ride in Queen Elizabeth's second carriage. Romania began mass exporting the goods that would bring foreign currency to the country's treasury in order to pay off its external debt, and continued to do so until the population was pushed to bring off extreme poverty, developed the cult of personality inspired by North Korea. On Christmas Day, he and his wife were murdered, signaling the end of communism in Romania. Life in communist prisons was actually referred to as an experiment, because the target was not so much to punish and correct bad habits as it was to change one's mind according to the torturer's wishes. Living conditions in the communist prisons were unimaginable, with everything considered evil so that men would neither die or even be able to live normally. In less than 2 years, Romania implemented and carried out the most horrific brainwashing program known as the Pitești experiment. Through torture, mockery, and the destruction of all human means, re-education consisted of several stages that, when completed, allowed the tortured person to be free of torment, but not through release, but through the privilege of being the one who tortures the next prisoners sent to Pitești. The re-education process consisted of 4 stages. External disclosure, denunciation of all person and facts he had kept hidden. internal disclosure to denounce a cellmate, a more compassionate guardian, or a re-educator who did not torture hard enough. Moral disclosure, denying all the values with which the detainee had entered prison, from family and honor to faith and friendship. The last stage was when the prisoner tortured a comrade, in the same ways as he had been tortured, for their testimony in which they recognized their faith and defended it. Some detainees are today passed among the saints to the Orthodox Church. The first act of the tragedy was going to take place at the end of 1947. It was planned in advance to open large construction sites, to carry out works that were as fantastic, humongous, as expensive and useless. For their execution, they used human labor. This gave the new leadership the opportunity to liquidate the undesirable enemies of the people. Thus began the arrest, the recruitment of ideal workers, without pay, without food, without clothing, carefully prepared for the vast constructions, seats that awaited them, the Grand Canal, the reeds of the Danube Delta, the great hydropower plants, the great highways, or for them to become good submissive retirees, with secured housing in the comfortable cells of prisons. In a very short amount of time, all the prisons and colonies were filled to the brim. Thousands of detainees, many of them buried alive, were killed at the Danube Canal, known as the Death Canal. The Danube Black Sea Canal is the fifth largest in the world, with Panama in first place. Nicknamed the Blue Highway, its construction began in 1949. Although such plans have existed since the 19th century, and at the beginning of the 20th century, the communist regime used the construction sites of the canal to exterminate its opponents. Hundreds of thousands of detainees arrived in the more than 10 forced labor camps. The exact number of dead remains unknown to the day, but the dramatic stories of the regime victims are still alive in the collective memory. In Salini, a few kilometers from the Danube, 40 kilometers from the port of Constanța, as a former political prisoner noted, the detainees were forced to make large blocks of cement, of about a ton, for the construction of a dam, and everything was done manually. The transportation of the cement bags that were then transformed in blocks and transported on stretchers, the mixing of the cement, etc.
Between 1965 and 1989, the second stage of Romanian communism took place, namely the National Communist period. In the early 1980s, the rationalization program began, which involved rationalizing essential goods and consumer goods to subsistence levels, all in order to have more goods to export, so that by the end of the decade, the foreign debt would be paid, this being a personal ambition of the dictator, an ambition that caused the suffering of millions of Romanians. So at the end of the 80s, Romania was a closed state, isolated politically and diplomatically, from which it was almost impossible to live as a simple citizen. Nostalgia has several explanations, one of which is related to the fact that people were young, and when you are younger, the shortcomings are more easily overlooked. Another explanation is that some of them enjoyed privileged positions within the Communist Party, which made them better regarded in society, and enjoyed all sorts of favors from other people who wanted to be in their favor. Also, the psychological factor intervenes, according to which memory is selective, so people tend to remember the positive moments and ignore or suppress the negative ones. The first myth we will address is the one that claims that unemployment was zero and everyone had a secure job. This myth, like all the others that will follow, has a grain of truth, but the devil hides in details. In order to maintain the unemployment rate at zero, the state, being the only employer, created jobs without increasing productivity. Thus, many factories were losing money and a large part of them were not upgraded because the vast majority of the money destined for investments went to the payment of salaries. This zero unemployment rate was guaranteed by the law of vagrancy, which provided that everyone should be present at work and those who did not comply were imprisoned and in more serious cases sent to work hard in projects like People's House or Danube Canal Black Sea. The second myth is about economy, which was more developed, and the living that was better according to older citizens. If we take a look at the economic factors from 1989 and today, we can easily observe, just from analyzing the numbers, that Romania is doing much better in the economic field and as well in the level of living. Another strong point of the economy is the fact that in 1989, Romania wasn't in external debt anymore. To make that possible, there was implemented a policy in which exports were the main priority, to the detriment of internal market, and the investments meant to be for re-engineering the industry stopped because for those needed to be made loans. According to this plan, loans needed to be limited, along with a rationalization program similar to a wartime program, rations often being insufficient. The third myth is about a program of rationalization, considered to be necessary by a part of the population in order to pay the external debt, but not in the criminal way it was applied. This program was first created at the beginning of the 80s to facilitate the payment of the external debt. In this program, base products, milk, eggs, bread, meat, flour, sugar, and oil were given on the basis of a card, which if lost or stolen was very hard to replace. The quantity given were often insufficient, people being held at the limit of subsistence and forced to either resort to theft to assure their meal, either to the black market. But the rationalization wasn't only applied in the food field, but also in the energetic field, power outages being very frequent and even in factories and enterprises. At the same time, the heating during winter was limited to 14 degrees Celsius. More than that, at the end of the 80s, the level of absurdity reached levels so absurd that the hospitals lacked soap, detergents, medicine, lacks that led to the deterioration of the health system and the health of the population. The fourth myth is about the educational system, which was way better because there are international achievements in subjects like mathematics, but also due to the fact that the graduation rate was higher. This myth is partly correct, but it is not taken into account the spanking and corporal punishment were the order of the day, and the emphasis was placed first on discipline and only after the education itself. Also, Romania has enjoyed achievements in mathematics and medicine for a long time, but promotions have started to be awarded on political criteria, which led to the deterioration of the education system because the party considers loyalty more important than capability. The fifth myth claims that before 1989, crime rate was lower and corruption almost did not exist. Nothing more false. It is well known that the workers stole from the enterprises in the cities and from the agricultural cooperatives in the villages anything that could be sold or used in their own households. Thus, networks were formed to obtain goods that were not found in stores. These networks enjoyed the help of the heads of institutions, officials, officers of the security, militiamen, etc., who, in exchange for money or products, allowed these clandestine businesses. Moreover, in some urban areas, militia had no control. In these areas, organized crime was frequent. Communism was one of the periods that marked the 20th century as one of the hardest in history. Although many live with nostalgia for those times, indoctrinated by the ideas of the regime, today the price that had to be paid for so-called prosperity, from the annulment of fundamental rights to the exploitation of innocent people, even to death, is revealed, and the goal never justifies the means.